Welcome to the Private Equity Exchange, the only summit bridging the gaps between limited partners, private equity funds, corporate executives, and entrepreneurs. With over 1,000 delegates, the Private Equity Exchange is the only venue where LPs, private equity firms, corporate executives, and entrepreneurs meet. Before the events, using our internet platform, schedule one-on-one meetings with delegates that matter most to you, and exchange far more than business cards at your deal meetings at the Private Equity Exchange. Gather great market insight with over 120 speakers and 6 tracks to choose from. The Private Equity Exchange, the largest private equity event in Europe for CEOs, funds, and LPs. You are looking at Restructuring and Turnaround. Introducing
As David said, I'm currently Group Finance Director of Laing plc, which is an international construction company. But I did spend 4 years at Meridian from August of 2002 through to May of 2006. And for 2.5 of those years, I was its Chief Financial Officer and worked with Murdoch and a number of other people in the restructuring of Meridian. And I thought, given the topic of this afternoon, if I explained to you a bit about what happened at Meridian and how we resolved the issues, it then might put the questions and answers into context. And certainly when the Q&A questions come along, I hope it can be an interactive session. So, I'm delighted actually to be speaking here today because, of course, the Étoile was the first Meridian hotel. It opened in 1972, and some might say, if they've stayed here, that some of the rooms haven't been renovated since. That wasn't my fault. So what are we? We were, and we are, an upmarket global hotel group. We had 130 hotels in 56 countries, and 35 of those hotels were owned and leased. We had more than 35 hotels when I joined, owned and leased assets when I joined Meridian, and I'd like to talk to you a bit about that later on. We were based in London, but we did have a global presence. We had regional offices in Dubai, in Hong Kong, and here in Paris. We also had an American operation which used to be headquartered in New York, but I moved it to Chicago, where we had some operations. Le Meridian has always had a European flavour, and I sincerely hope it will continue to do so under its new ownership. But I think one of the most important things that I want to talk about is, if you look at the group structure, and we'll talk about that in a few moments, we actually had over 200 legal entities in the group, and we had 35 owned and leased assets. So that may give you some idea of one of the issues that we faced. Our revenues globally, including our managed estate, were about £1 billion sterling. We had an EBITDA of around 50 million. But again, as you'll hear later, unfortunately, the interest cost was slightly more than that. So that was an issue. We were acquired in 2001 by a private equity group, and they had significant ambitions to grow the brand through a CapEx program funded by Royal Bank of Scotland and through a number of new hotel openings, particularly in Asia. Okay, so in 2001, a private equity group acquired Meridian. There were 4 or 5 shareholders inside that private equity grouping, and they put their equity in by way of subordinated debt. We then had, if you like, it's called here an overseas funding group. Basically, it was a series of international banks who provided senior debt, which was around 750 million in those days, a senior mezzanine tranche, and a junior mezzanine tranche. And again, when we come to talk about some of the issues, you can already see we've got 4 funding groups there. In addition, there was a UK funding group, which was primarily Royal Bank of Scotland, who provided funding to do a sale and leaseback for 11 UK hotels, including the Grosvenor House in London and the Waldorf. And the senior security package was a global security package. And what became evident as we went through the restructuring process was that what security means in one country is very different to what security means in another. So let's talk you through the timeline. As I said, I joined in August 2002, and it became pretty apparent to me on about day 3 that we were unlikely to have sufficient cash to last very long. Put it another way, it wasn't my fault. I was actually in India in January of 2003 talking to our hotel owners. I was in the back of a taxi when my then boss called me and said we defaulted. I said, so tell me news. But it took us from January of 2003 until November of 2005 to sort this issue out. Murdoch, as you heard, is a renowned individual in the world of restructuring. We hired him in April. He said, I'll be out by Christmas. Fortunately, he didn't say which Christmas. But what happened when we breached our covenants was, the banks then obviously started to get quite excited. And because we had so many different groups, we had the senior group, the senior mayors, the junior, the RBS situation, and then the equity, they all started to polarize themselves into their own little corners. And indeed, in July 2003, the UK funding group was able to put 2 of our hotels into receivership. I was actually on holiday. It was about the only time during this process I was on holiday. My daughter said to me, she said, Daddy, do you think the bank could wait till next week to put them into liquidation so that you can finish your holiday? Which I thought was quite sweet of her. Unfortunately, they chose to ignore her comments. Anyway, between July and November 2003, we worked with the UK funding group, and eventually we got out from underneath all these leases at 0 cost to the group. And I think that was one of the defining moments in the Meridian process, because what it did was it released £1 billion of off-balance sheet debt away from the group, and it allowed investors and bankers to really understand what the profits and cash flows and business was of Meridian. And within 30 days of that deal being completed, a bank came along and bid for the whole of the senior and senior mezzanine debt. There were preemption rights contained in that documentation, and Lehman Brothers then ended up acquiring the entirety of the senior debt. And that was great news for us as managers of the company, because it meant instead of having a disparate senior bank group, we then only had one bank to deal with. During 2004, or particularly during the first quarter of 2004, we spent an awful lot of time attending meetings and going through due diligence processes so people could understand exactly what Meridian was about and what they were investing into. And I was fortunate enough to be appointed CFO of Meridian on the 1st of January 2004. By the end of 2004, we had negotiated heads of terms with Starwood Hotels, who, as you know, now own the Meridian brand, and with a private equity group that was put together to acquire the owned and leased assets. And really, 2005 was spent trying to conclude that deal, and I'll explain some of the complex issues to you in a moment. And lastly, on the 24th of November last year, we concluded the transaction. I'm delighted to say that all the debt got repaid, and therefore, as far as I was concerned, it was an extremely successful recapitalization. So, why did Meridian get into the position that it got into? Firstly, the deal was concluded with the private equity group on the 11th of July 2001, and of course we all know the tragic events of the 9th of September. We then had SARS, we then had other issues around the world, and as people stopped traveling, so we suffered. And we suffered more than most because, of course, we didn't have a balance sheet that was conducive to going through a downturn. It's also fair to say that our financial systems weren't perhaps what they ought to have been, and that generated a lack of confidence amongst all our stakeholders. We clearly, as we went into 2003 and we breached our covenants, our auditors started to get nervous. They started to qualify our audit reports, and that exacerbated the issue. Then when you looked around the world and you were trying to work out how best to deal with this, you find that whilst debt is debt in any country, the reality is very different in different countries, and how you get debt repaid and how you're able to restructure balance sheets in different territories, even though they're all, or primarily they were all in the European Union, is really very tricky. Of course, some of our customers got worried about our survivability, and we had to spend an awful lot of time communicating to our staff and to our customers about what was going on. The sad fact is that Meridian was a great company. It was a great brand, and it had great profits. The only problem was that the debt mountain that it took on board in July 2001 swamped it. I talked to you earlier about the complex corporate structure and about 200 entities. I thought I would just share this with you. That was our group structure in October of 2005. 35 hotels, over 200 legal entities. You wouldn't believe, if I put the intercompany balance matrix on that slide, you wouldn't see anything. Oh, happened automatically. Okay, so as part of the restructuring plan, what we had to do was divide the business into the management business, which was capable of being sold to Starwood Hotels, and the owned and leased asset business, which was retained in a joint venture structure. We started off with those 200 companies. That's what we ended up with, and actually everything north of the subsidiary line was effectively put in place by the new shareholders for tax reasons. So that is all we needed to run the business. It's a very clear structure. Cash can move up and down the structure inside individual territories very easily, and investors can well understand what is going on. So, in terms of the issues and the problems that we had to deal with and how we solved them, I've talked to you about the complexity of the corporate structure. I've explained how we needed to divide the management business from the assets. I've also explained how some of the objectives between the various lender groups were somewhat diverse, and how we were able to try and bring them together. And to be honest, I think that's one of the chief objectives of a corporate restructuring officer. And that is to be able to take an independent view of the organization, to be able to go and talk to each of these lender groups, and essentially to take away some of the emotion. I'm sure there are some bankers in the room, but sometimes when they never like to get their money back, in my opinion, but when they're told that they might not get it back, they do sometimes get somewhat emotional. And I understand that. And as I say, Murdoch spent an awful lot of time talking to the various lender groups, explaining the fact that actually they had lent into a good business, that it was still a good business, and to take precipitative action would actually destroy more value for them than if they actually allowed us to trade our way out. And as I've explained to you, by trading our way out, we did actually get all the debt repaid. What was very interesting to me was to look and actually see at first hand and experience the different cultures amongst the various groups. Our investor base ended up being American, and the Americans found it very difficult to understand how we had to go through certain processes, not just in the UK, but if I take France, for example, you know, we had to go and get Workers' Council consent to do all these things. And that was completely antipathy to the American view, which is, you know, if they don't want to do it, just fire them. Well, that sort of doesn't quite work in a number of other countries around the world. And so being able to educate them to understand that actually, you know, people do things differently and we're not all American was actually quite challenging. In addition, when we were going through this restructuring process and we were taking out a whole load of companies and we were moving companies around, maintaining the tax structures in each of these entities was vital. Because it was very, you know, having a company that had lost money at the PBT level, it was very keen to ensure that we retained those tax losses. Another issue that we found, and we found this pretty early on in the process, but it became more critical as time went on, was being able to release cash, to get the cash to be used to retire the debt. And sometimes the debt was in jurisdictions other than where the cash was. If you take France, for example, France was a very profitable cash-generative business, but it didn't have huge amounts of debt in it compared to other jurisdictions. And finding mechanisms to be able to move the cash around to get it into the right slot without A, breaking a French law, or B, upsetting the tax structuring was very complicated. We then found this wonderful concept of check the box. In order for our American investors to be able to get a pass-through for tax purposes, we had to undertake various tasks, and one of these was checking the box, which is a US filing requirement. A very, very tedious process. Okay, thank you very much for listening. What I tried to do this afternoon is to set the scene as to what people like Murdoch and his colleagues do. I found it an invaluable experience to have somebody sitting alongside me who could take an independent view, who could act as our advisor and as our guide. I certainly have never been in a situation like that before. I sincerely hope I'm not again, but I have learned a huge amount in the 4 years I was at Meridian. Thank you for listening.